Today's stream is about to start. We'll talk about code or whatever we'll talk about today. It's about to start, so please hang tight while I check that everything is okay. Sound check, camera check, lights check. How's my hair? Oh, wait, I don't have any hair. Maybe put some pants on and I am good to go. So get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Hello everyone, and let's talk about code today, shall we? It's always special to have a guest with me, and today I have a friend of the channel here, Theo. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Good, good. I just realized that the layout of the cameras is a bit weird. How about we do it like this?
Yeah, sure.
That is better. So, you're here with us to talk about Clap and your own fork of iPlug and how you're implementing Clap on your fork of iPlug, and you even started using it on some plugins, right?
Oh yeah, because a while ago Reaper added Clap support, at least in pre-release. And so I was kind of curious what Clap is and how difficult it is to implement it. And so I first added it just on the fly to one plugin, a very simple plugin, just to see how that would go. And it turned out it wasn't all that hard. So by now I have implemented it more properly, I hope.
And I believe you beat the Reaper guys to it, because the official support for Clap is not out yet.
Oh, but mine isn't out yet either. So
Oh, okay.
I've created a special branch for the Clap support on my iPlug fork. So I'm not really sure if I've implemented things right yet. So.
And was it most out of curiosity because you already support other formats? I suppose you support like VSTs and audio units and maybe even the AAX format?
No, actually, I only support VST2 and AU at the moment. So
I see.
So it was also more a question of, I thought it would be take more effort to do it. So I wanted to know how much effort, just so that we could assess if Clap was something we wanted to support in the first place.
And what is your general feeling right now?
Oh, we're probably going to support it because it only took an afternoon to implement it just on the fly. And it took a little more effort, of course, to implement it properly, but it's not that hard because it's pretty nice, protocol, I guess.
And one thing that we have talked about before in the channel is that Clap is not only, and I think we talked about this with Jatin when we had him over, it's not only about one other format that happens to be less encumbered by other companies having like user agreements that you have to sign, that sort of thing. But it's also, from a technical standpoint, a little bit different from other formats, the way that the queue works and the way that you can use automation on top of sliders, not just controlling a slider, but you can still have access to a slider and automate it. So there are some, let's say, different features when it comes to Clap. So are you interested in exploring those, or for now it will be mostly just another format for the same plugin?
Yeah, for now it will be the same as VST2. That's my aim at the moment, just to get it working exactly the same. But of course, in the future, maybe we'll use some of the specific features. I don't know yet.
Yeah, and
so also, for example, it also means that automation will not be sample accurate for me for now, because VST2 doesn't support that, and it was easier to just adapt clap, so it also doesn't do that. But clap could do that in a future version, so clap can already do that, but I could do that in a future version.
Right. And do you imagine that there would be like features that would transform the plugin and would allow for new use cases, new kinds of perhaps sounds you could make out of it? Or do you think it's mostly like the details like sample accurate automation and that sort of thing?
Well, it also has a feature called, you can also automate parameters without actually changing the parameter value. So a sort of relative mode in automation, and that's something we could maybe add in the future. But of course, one problem is then that only clap supports that and not the other formats. So I'm not too sure if and when we're going to do that, because I would rather have my plugin work the same in all formats, but we might at some point.
And there are no magic features you just get for free out of clap that you wouldn't get from other formats. There is no free lunch, right?
No, not really. That being said, it is pretty. The implementation is pretty simple and pretty nice. Lots of things are optional, so that's cool. So yeah, but yeah. So for example, that sample accurate automation you only get if you do something yourself as well. So
fair enough. Well, I guess it would be difficult for a new standard to just give you magic new features for free. Even things like sliders and parameters you have to be in control of when you are doing the plugin. So it makes sense that you would have to add some extra code to support that. And you are testing with Reaper and Bitwig, right?
Yes, mostly Reaper, because that was the reason why I was looking into it anyway. And then, of course, I also installed the latest Bitwig because I heard that it also supported it, just to test if it's nice if it works in Reaper, but the clap support in Reaper is also experimental, so it's good to have a host that already has clap in the official version.
And is this something that works across platforms? I suppose you mostly develop for Windows and Mac, but does it also work on Linux?
Oh, I don't know. I think so. Reaper probably supports clap on Linux. Bitwig is also for Linux, I think. I'm not sure.
I think so.
Anyway, my plugins are not for Linux at the moment, so I haven't really tested that. Yeah.
Fair enough.
That's
All
the
right.
reason why it didn't work, so.
I guess you would just have to set up a whole new build environment on Linux, right?
Yeah, so probably type a makefile or something. It's more, yeah. I guess we could probably do that. Of course, at the moment we're only doing VST2 and OW, so we don't really have a reason to go to Linux. But once we do support clap, then we might also add Linux versions of our plugins.
And it seems as though there is not a lot of interest, because otherwise you would have considered some other plugin format like LV2 that is supported on Linux.
Yeah, well, in an ideal world, I would also like to add that to my iPlug fork, but yeah, I don't think there's many people using that. So, for example, adding AAX support would come first, because there are a lot more people using that. So,
fair enough.
But the same clap, of course. Nobody's using clap at the moment, so you never know.
Yeah, well, no one is using it at the moment, but let's see how it's implemented. So can you show us how you did it?
Yeah, sure. The thing with, I can first explain a bit. Clap is only has C header files. That's all it is, basically, for the plugin and for the host as well. So all you kind of have to do is include a single header file. And then, of course, you have to implement a sort of glue code between the clap headers and whatever you already have. So in my case, that was iPlug. But that's basically how you implement clap. And that's a bit different from other APIs I've thus far implemented. Because most of the time you have to download an SDK, and the SDK contains code and more code, and you have to make sure that all that works. So that was kind of nice, that it's just a C API, and you don't really have to worry about any glue code. Of course, you have to then write your own code, but hey.
I
I think
see.
there is also a C++ wrapper available, by the way, but I didn't use that. So
Ah, okay. But the standard, the default, so to speak, is just a bunch of headers in C.
yeah,
Fair enough.
and you only include one header because that header will then include the other headers. So you don't really have to know about the headers. You have to have them, of course, but you don't really need to know about them.
Okay, so if you were not using iPlug and if you just wanted to implement an iClap, if you just wanted to implement a clap plugin from scratch, you would download these headers, you would point your compiler at them, and that would be that. There would be no producer, no here are these thousands of Xcode projects, Visual Studio projects, and so on that you have to figure out. It is
Well,
conceptually simpler, it seems.
well, you do have to do all that but you have to do that yourself then. You can do that yourself. That's the good news. But you still have to do that, of course, because Clap won't give you a GUI. You have to make that yourself. So you have to program that and you have to set up projects for that. So Clap doesn't help you with that.
Ah, and when it
And
comes to the user interface, what do you do? Do you, I guess in your case, you use iPlug, but you are free to hook to any user interface library or tool or framework that you want to use.
yeah, sure. So the first time I implemented the test plugin in Clap, it was just without a UI at all, because that was much easier. So you can do that. But you can also use whatever homebrew code you want to use, or because Clap only defines how the host and the plugin talk to one another, but it doesn't really define anything else. So,
and there are these generic user interface libraries and frameworks and tools like GTK, Qt, and so on. But when it comes to audio plugins, it seems like most people are using either something like VST GUI or using, I guess in iPlug they have their own thing. They have iGraphics, and Juice, of course, is its own thing. In your case, I don't think you're using any of that, right?
No, I do have iGraphics because that's part of iPlug. But my version of iGraphics is just a wrapper around LICE, which is part of Whittle, which is also what Reaper uses to draw the skins and all that of Reaper. So.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought that iGraphics was an iPlug 2 thing, but it has been around since iPlug, I guess.
Yeah, it's a bit weird because the original iPlug had iGraphics as a sort of abstract layer, and you could then subclass it and make your own GUI. But then and there were a couple of different ways of doing that. And at some point, Justin Frankel suggested to remove that and just always use LICE for everything. So I did that. But weirdly enough, now iPlug 2 has many graphic systems built on top. So they undid that and they re-added different systems. But I'm not using that. So for me, it's just LICE. And LICE is just, LICE can draw images. And that's basically it. So. And also I'm actually programming all this for Win32, so for Windows. And then when I'm targeting Mac, I'm using Swell, which is also part of Whittle. And that mimics some of the Win API calls on Mac OS. So my plugin doesn't really know it's running on Mac and just does Windows API calls. And that's nice because then I only have to code it once. So, yeah.
And that's how Reaper itself is implemented as far as we can tell, right?
Largely. I don't think everything. There are probably parts where it says if def Win32, and then you can put your Windows stuff there. But mostly, yeah. That's why they can build it for Linux, for Windows, for Mac OS. Yeah.
And I have never used LICE directly, so when you are programming at that level, I suppose it's going to be similar in terms of abstractions to what we get in JSFX. In other words, not much, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, exactly.
And do you have your own components and libraries on top of that?
Oh, yeah, because that's one of the things. If you have iPlug, then you can draw an image, and there are some helpers like draw a line or something, but there's very little, even less than LICE itself. And of course, you can talk LICE directly to iPlug as well. so you can skip one of the layers. But like you said, you can't really do anything useful with UI, so you have to add your own components, and everybody does that. So, but that's not part of my iPlug fork because I think that's too specific. Everybody wants to do that differently. So there are some classes for like a on-off switch, and there's a class for like an image strip knob. So that's part of iPlug. But you probably want to subclass that and customize it for your plugin or for your set of plugins or whatever.
All right. I'm going to say hello to Mage and Bo and Mr. Jav here on the chat. Hello to you all, and make sure to ask questions if you are thinking about implementing clap on some of your experiments, or if you just want to know more about it. And yeah, can you show us some of the code, perhaps how you would start with these C headers and make sense of them? What are the, I guess, functions you would have to implement, that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. If you can switch to my shared screen.
It is there.
Excellent. Okay, so I can show most of it in GitHub, I guess. So this is my GitHub page, and my iPlug repository is right here. And we're on the main branch, so there's no clap yet. So let's go to the branch. iPlug is also just a set of C++ headers and source files, basically, and some project files. And so almost everything you see here, all these files were already there. The only files I've added for clap are these two files here. That's basically my clap support. But of course, I did need the header files from clap themselves.
Yeah. When it comes to getting these SDKs, different frameworks have different solutions. Juice will try to download them for you. iPlug 2 has a little shell script you have to run. And in your case, how do you deal with that?
Well, at the moment, I'm not sure. Clap is MIT licensed, so in theory, I could just include the headers in iPlug. But I haven't done that yet because for VST you cannot do that. And for OW you don't have to do that. So I think I will just keep it like it is. And then that means you have to download the headers yourself. But I have an example project for my iPlug fork. And by now that also has a clap branch. And there I've explained how to do that in a sort of README how-to document. And for the clap part, I've just pointed it to the clap repository, and you can just download the zip file there and then extract only a portion of that zip file, because that's all you need. So if we click to the clap repository, then I can show you, this is the entire clap repository, but most of it is documentation and other help files, because the real, the include files you need are in the include clap folder. And so these are the C headers you need to include, or you at least need to add clap support.
It's not that many, it's not too scary.
It's not that bad. So the clap core is what you see now here. However, that's not all, because if you would only use these headers, then your plugin would have no parameters, for example. Because most things in clap are extensions, meaning they're optional. So you can make a plugin without parameters in clap. That's a valid thing.
Okay, I guess the bare minimum would be just the communication of audio streams between host and guest, or host and plugin.
Yeah, except that audio itself is also optional. So the framework for exchanging audio is there, but the actual audio ports, as they call them, so audio channels, that's also optional. That's an extension.
Oh, because maybe your plugin is doing MIDI, so you wouldn't be reading audio.
Exactly.
I see. So by default, the host and the plugin don't communicate at all without extensions.
Well, they do, because I can show you. So there's a bunch of header files which the host and the plugin share. And of course, there's host, that's for the host, so I don't do a lot with that. But then there is a plugin, I think it is. And this is something that defines some structures that your plugin has to fill and return to the host. And one of the things that's in those structures is callback functions. You can see some here, for example. This is the init callback. But there is also a process callback here. And so the plugin has to provide these callback function pointers to the host, and then the host will call them. So even if your plugin does absolutely nothing, it could still have a process function, and it could still be called by the host.
Okay.
Of course, that doesn't have to do much because there's no audio, but...
By default, there is no audio. By default, there is no MIDI. I suppose that MIDI is also an extension.
Yes,
by
sure.
default, there are no parameters. And
Yes.
I guess there is the channel of communication, and that's what that function boils down to. It is the way that the host is going to talk to the plugin, but there is nothing to talk about without extensions.
Yeah, but not exactly, because it's only the bare minimum the host and the plugin wanted to talk about. Because, for example, if you want parameters in your plugin, and you probably want that, then you have to use an extension, and the header files for that are in the ext folder. And if you look inside there are more structures, again with callbacks. So, for example, this parameter structure has a callback that determines how many parameters you have here. So you have to provide those also. So all the extensions also have their own callbacks. So that does mean there are a lot of callbacks.
I'm not sure I understand why they're going for this kind of design, because if your extensions are kind of baked into the, let's say, the protocol between host and plugin, it seems like because you have all these callback functions, you're sort of baking in the, I guess you're hard coding stuff that in theory could be just one big process function, and then you would deal with all the cases inside.
Yeah.
And it would be easier to hot swap stuff.
Yeah, maybe. Because what you're describing is basically VST2. That's more of one big function that does everything. And I can show you. I have to go back to iPlug itself. If we look in the in iPlug VST2 is also just two files, a header and a source file. And if I look in the source file, then there should be some dispatch function somewhere. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, that's the one. So this also has a couple of callbacks, but this is like you said, it only has a couple. And then this dispatcher does most of the work. So, for example, if the effect is loaded, then this dispatcher is called with a special code, and that code is in the opcode parameter here. And if that code contains the value effect open, for example, then it means, oh, your effect has just loaded, init it please. And so VST works more like you would expect, with a one callback for many features. But then, of course, the problem is you have to kind of support all these features, or at least return 0 or something to indicate that you don't support them.
And having played around with these two ways of doing things, do you have a preference?
Well, I think I like the clap way better, but it's not because of that, because having some sort of dispatcher for the most used functions would have been fine by me as well. What I like about clap is that it's pure C, and there's no C++, there's almost no strings and other stuff going on, so it's very bare metal. I like that about it. So I think I would prefer clap, but
I see. And when it comes to these extensions, your plugin and the host have to support the extension for it to work, of course. But if either one does not support, then that's okay. The plugin will just not have that. So maybe it will not have parameters, for instance, if the host doesn't implement parameters.
Yeah, that would be pretty weird. But the thing is, let's assume the host is Reaper and that does support parameters, but your plugin does not. Then Reaper will call your plugin and ask for do you have the extension for parameters? And then of course the plugin will answer, no, I don't have that.
How does that communication work under the hood? Because you're trying to call a function pointer that does not exist. Or...
No, I'll show you. That's not the case because the host will first init everything, and there is a special callback that you always have to get to the extensions. That's the in my case that's this function, and that function the host will call this function a bunch of times, each time calling for a different extension. So it will call that function, for example, here with the clap parameters ID. And then it's asking the plugin, hey, plugin, do you have parameters? And of course, my plugin answers, yes, I do. Here is a struct with a bunch of function pointers. Please use them. And it's the same for all the other extensions.
So hey,
for example,
there you go. The code we have on the screen is functionally equivalent to the VST2 code we looked at before, where you would have a bunch of if then else's, I guess. In that case, it was probably a switch statement with opcodes, but it boils down to pretty much the same.
No, it doesn't, because this just returns the function pointer. So this extension function is called a bunch of times, but only when the plugin has just loaded. It's never called again after that, because once it has the function pointer for example here for the get parameter value, then it never has to call this get extension again. It can just call the if clap params get value to get the value of the parameter. So it doesn't have to go
through. So
difference, yeah.
Okay, I get that. It makes sense. I guess from an expressiveness perspective, it is more or less the same. You are expressing the extensions you support, and that is comparable. But I guess there is one advantage of doing things the clap way, and that is that you don't have to call the dispatcher all the time, and calling the dispatcher is probably a weak point in terms of performance.
Well, if it's a switch statement like you just saw, and if the opcoders are just simple enums or something like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, then it's probably a table lookup, so it's not so bad, like a jump table or something. And there's actually also a downside to what clap does, because you have to have a lot of function pointers around. And I'm guessing the host doesn't copy these, I hope, but I'm not really sure.
And the problem is that you have to dereference these pointers before you can do any function call, which amounts to something similar to the dispatcher in terms of performance, because it's a table lookup.
Sure, although the only thing is the host can do this at his side, so that might be a little faster. And also, of course, because one thing you could do, of course, is recode all this in C++ and use methods and whatnot, but then it would probably be, well, not faster anyway. So yeah, I don't think it matters much for efficiency, actually, because in the end it will call your process function, and that's going to do most of the calculations. So all this boilerplate code doesn't really matter anyway.
And I guess there is no way of having your cake and eating it too. If you want to have this dynamic notion of extensions that you either support or you don't, then you somehow have to pay the price of checking if the extension is supported or not.
Yeah, one thing I noticed is when I was building up the support for clap in my iPlug is it's very easy to not support an extension because you just leave all the code out. So it's very easy to slowly build your plugin from something that does nothing to something that does more and more. And that's not so easy with VST2 because there are lots of opcodes you have to handle. You have to return a specific value for just to say, I don't support it or whatever. So
that's a design decision that I really appreciate. When I first saw the boilerplate generated by Juice and the boilerplate generated by iPlug 2 in that case, I really liked what I saw in iPlug 2 because I didn't have to understand right away from the get-go, from having created a new project, I didn't have to understand the notion of different programs or presets, and the notion of enabling or disabling MIDI, and the notion of different buses with different channels in them. All of those things that just you get when you create a Juice project are not there in iPlug, and I like that. And of course, as you learn more about these things, you can add them.
Yeah, sure. So for example, first I didn't have a GUI, and this is all the function pointers for the GUI. But you have to realize that if we have this many function pointers, we also have this many functions. So I was very happy that as long as I didn't want a GUI, I could just leave this out. And it means I can also leave all the function this is pointing to out. So if I search for this function, yeah, so all of the code from here and down below is all the GUI code. So I didn't have to do that at first, just to see if parameters, I could test parameters before I added the GUI, which was very nice.
Great. So let's go over a few of these extensions to see what they look like. We have parameters, we have audio. In your case, because you're doing software instruments, we also have MIDI. You have to read MIDI. And what else?
Well, let's go to the extension function again. Yeah, so, well, parameters, of course. State, because you want to save and load your parameter values, and other state if you plug in back with a project you're using it in.
And just to make sure that I understand this right, in JSFX we sort of get this for free. The serialized block does not have to deal with the sliders. It has to deal with other state you may have, but with the sliders, JSFX deals with that for you. But in the case of Clap, or I guess in any other plugin format, you are in charge of storing your own parameters, right?
Well, VST2 actually has a mode in which it will also automatically store all automatable parameters. So, but you probably don't want to use that, because then you can only add parameters on the bottom, and you can never really change anything because there's no versioning, no nothing. So most of the time you will want to do it yourself, and then of course you have to do it yourself. But Clap indeed does not have anything. So if you don't implement this Clap state extension, well, then of course your parameters simply won't be saved.
Fair enough.
But maybe if you don't have any parameters, that's of course fine. So.
Yeah, and I guess there would be some plugins that don't have any parameters, like the Air Windows plugins sometimes don't have any parameters. They just do what it says on the tin. It's like I don't know, a console emulation thing. It is emulating that flavor of console, nothing about it.
Sure, and the test plugin I was running was a MIDI sound module, so it reacts to MIDI, but it has no parameters because you have to do everything using MIDI. So
nice. I get the feeling that these Clap headers are made for humans to consume, and I appreciate that because you can leave out things you don't care about.
Yeah. Well, next we have audio ports, because Clap has audio channels, but they're grouped into ports. So my iPlug at the moment only supports one audio port for input and one audio port for output, because then within that port you can have multiple channels. So, but you can also have multiple ports if that's something you want to have. So
multiple ports would be for something like if you have a main source of audio and a side channel that perhaps you are doing a compressor and you would like some kind of side channel, that would be a separate port?
I think so, but I guess Clap doesn't really specify that, or maybe I just haven't read it yet. But the thing is, in Reaper, this of course doesn't really make sense because you can route anything to anything. So I guess it also depends on the host. But there might be some hosts that only support sidechaining if you have a second port. I think that's probably true, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see. And when it comes to like understanding all this, learning about all this, I suppose you found some examples online, like the example that Schwa created. But other than that, how is the documentation look like?
Well, that is also a nice thing, in my opinion at least. If we go back to the Clap Guess I should have opened a separate tab for that. I will now. Because now I have to switch the clap again. So there is some documentation, but I think it's actually extracted from the source code. So I only look in the source code for documentation. So when we, for example, open the main header, there's some license stuff. Oh, there's not much here. This is not a good example.
And I see that in that import, there are a bunch of extensions already. So they are sort of saying, you probably want to use these extensions at least.
Oh, no, it includes all of them, actually.
Ah.
I'll show you. All of the extensions, and even the extensions that are still in draft, so they're not finalized yet, are included. Because it's just header files and structure definitions. There's no actual code in there, so there's no harm in including it. And that's kind of nice, because that means in your plugin you only have to include clap.h, and that's it. And then you have, basically, you could use all of the extensions if you want, but you don't have to. Because there's no code besides these headers, so that's another nice thing, yeah. So let's pick another one. Let's pick, I don't know, events. So this contains C or C++ style comments, and that's, I think, is the most useful documentation at least. But there's actually quite a lot there. And the nice thing is you can immediately also see the code. So this makes a lot of sense to me. So I was very happy with this. So adding stuff like this is reading a lot here and thinking about this, and sometimes not understanding it until later.
But Sue, that seems very manageable. We can see that it's not a long file and there are not that many of them.
No. On the other hand, some things are not that well defined, I think. But so it could be a bit more documentation is probably useful, but.
And I guess more documentation will come out further down the line because it's still very early in this process.
Yeah, Clap is at version 1.1.1, I think, at the moment. But I believe the version before version 1 was 0.2 or something. So yeah, I think it has to, it will become more mature in time, I guess.
Right.
And also, if more hosts implement it, then more people will have questions. If more plugin developers implement it, people will have more questions. So.
Yeah, right. So can we see in your fork of iPlug how you implement some of the most basic things, like perhaps the parameters or maybe processing audio or maybe MIDI, but the thing that you think makes like the gentler introduction to implementing one extension?
Yeah, sure. We'll just browse through the file and see what looks not too daunting. Well, it's actually not that much either. So, because let's have a look. The whole file, the whole source file is it's 1118 lines. So it's not so bad. So let's pick something, not the GUI, I think, because that's the code that's probably the weirdest, the less straightforward code. So let's do something like parameters, I guess.
I guess the first few things we saw in the file had to do with different operating systems.
Yeah, so on Apple I need a special header here, so that's why there's an if there for Apple, yeah.
And that is the bridge between the Win32 APIs and the I guess the Swell thing that translates this to Mac?
No, that's elsewhere in iPlug, so we don't need that here. It's just that we need iGraphics here. You can see that here. There's sort of generic iGraphics for all platforms. But there's some special code below for Mac, and that's why I also need a specific Mac header here. But that's just a thing, a solution I came up with. So it's probably not the cleanest, but it works. So So in general, there should not be much if-def apple inside the clap implementation. Ideally, there should be none, but this is just the exception. Because the VST implementation also has this, so I just kept it and it works. So
Okay.
let's find some parameters. There's a lot of things called parameter, of course. Yeah, so here we're at the extension thing again. So when the host calls my plugin with clapx params, then it asks, do you support parameters? And if so, please give me a table of function pointers. And so we get this bunch of functions. Now, the first function you need is a function that returns how many parameters you have. So that should be a pretty straightforward function. So let's see if that's true. And of course it is, because this is just the basic thing is that it here returns the number of parameters my iPlug plugin has. But to do that, it does need to have a pointer to the iPlug object, and that's what this first line is doing.
I see.
Getting the pointer to the plugin, because again, this is a C interface, so this function is actually a C function.
Interesting. So you are taking this member function and providing it as a C function.
Yeah, because on at least Intel 64-bit, C++ and C are the same. They have the same calling convention, so you can just do that. And most other platforms I support at the moment also, so I don't have to worry about it too much. But it does mean that I cannot call a method, a class method, because there's no this pointer. So you just get this one clap plugin pointer, and the clap plugin here, that is a special struct. And one of the things that struct has is a plugin data member, and you can put your own pointer in there. So what I did when I created this plugin in the constructor, I filled that member variable with the dis pointer, and now I can get the dis pointer out of there again, and then use it to return the number of parameters for my plugin.
Okay, that's a bit of handstanding there, but it's only because you already have all this infrastructure in place that is your iPlug infrastructure, and you want to glue that to the way clap works. But if you were to just create a clap plugin, this could be a function that literally just returns one number if you wanted.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so if you hardcode, because you're just making one plugin with 6 parameters, sure, then you could just write return 6. You don't even need the parameter here that I'm using, because you can just return 6 and be done with it. Yeah, sure.
Interesting. Okay, I like that. And let me make sense of these parameters. You have 2 parameters there, or do you have one parameter with a type that is very weird?
You mean here?
Yeah, because I don't remember seeing this const something before.
Yeah. It's a style I've adopted, I think, a couple of years ago to make everything I can constant, because then I cannot accidentally change it, because my compiler will give an error. And also it will help the compiler somewhat with optimizations. So what this means is I have a type, a clap plugin, and I have a pointer to that type. But that pointer is constant, so you cannot change whatever that pointer is pointing to. And the last constant means that this variable that it's stored in is also constant, so you cannot change it.
Oh boy, interesting.
And the other thing is the order in which I write this is probably, you can probably vary in the order of things here. So some people will write this differently, but this is my favorite way of writing this. So this is a constant pointer, which points to something that is constant. And it gets even more fun if you have pointers to pointers.
I bet. Yeah, I can imagine that. So what's the difference in this context between a constant pointer and what we would call a reference in C++?
This last constant makes it kind of like a reference, because a reference is also something that you cannot change. You can change the thing it points to, but you cannot change the reference itself. So this last const has the same sort of functionality.
I see.
And the first const is just so that you cannot change anything this pointer points to. So in other words, I cannot assign plugin data, for example, because the pointer is constant, so it points to something that you're not supposed to change.
I like this. I don't like the verbosity of it, but I do like the concept behind it, because I have a lot of experience in functional programming languages that tend to favor immutability. So I appreciate this, even if it means that we see 1,000 consts in the code base.
Yeah, it's something that a lot of this is probably not necessary, because especially in this small bit of code, the compiler can also figure out by itself that I'm not changing this plug variable. But hey, now at least if I change it by accident, I will know.
Yeah, and you're not only talking to a compiler, you're mostly talking to other people.
Yeah,
so.
Or to myself in a year, yeah.
Yeah. All right, okay, so simple enough. That's just a function that returns a number, and we are doing a bit of extra work to make it play nice with the rest of the iPlug infrastructure.
And the extra work is also, because it's so small a function, you can really, it stands out. But if you look just below here, we have another function called clap params get info, which gets some information about the parameter, and it immediately starts with the same line again. But now, of course, that line is only one line of many, and so it's not so bad anymore. In other words, all of the functions, almost all of the functions for clap that have function pointers pointing to it have this first line, because I always need a pointer to my object, because else I cannot do anything. So
yeah, you are constructing a little object system there.
Yeah, but that's where the plugin data is for. Because suppose that we were writing a plugin in pure C, you could also do that. You don't have to use C++. Then, of course, you would put a pointer to some struct in this variable probably, so that you can put then all your settings in that struct, all your parameters, and I don't know what.
All right.
But then you're kind of building C++ in C, but
yes,
that's what you generally do. So.
Okay, so this is going to get us information about parameters. I suppose that information is like the name, the range, the limits.
Exactly, yeah.
The step I meant to say.
Yeah, and well, the limits as well. And also if an parameter is automatable and that sort of thing. And of course, in my iPlug, parameters are already have a known behavior, so I'm just trying to mimic that. So all my parameters are always automatable. None of my parameters are hidden, for example, because that's just not something that my iPlug supports. So.
Okay. And
then there's some weirdness with step parameters, but I'm not going to get into that now. But
okay. Okay. This makes sense. Everything that I see is very sensible. So there is not a lot of work in going to this. Can we briefly talk about that mutex? Why is that necessary?
Well, in this instance, I'm not really sure if it's necessary. But the thing is, I used VST2 as a template, and VST2 also has a sort of get parameter info function, and that used the mutex there. So I mostly copied mutexes from VST2, and also it won't hurt. But there are instances where it is important. For example, here is a function called params get value. That will get a value from a parameter, and there the mutex is necessary because the GUI might access the parameter at the same time as the audio or main thread. And then you have to protect that against reading half a parameter or something. So it's a sort of race condition protection.
No, I see that. So what you're saying is that the audio thread is going to try to get the value of a parameter and it may be locked?
Well, I hope not, because then the audio thread has to wait. So that's why you have to make sure that it happens really. That's a really short time that it's locked. But yeah, so in the GUI you are dragging a knob up and down, and that will of course change the value. But at the same time, your process function is processing samples, and when your process function is processing samples, you really cannot change the parameter values, because then it would interrupt the audio. So then the GUI has to wait a short while until your process function is ready. That will release the mutex, and then the GUI can change the parameter value.
Okay. So if the GUI is changing a parameter value at a given point, when the audio thread is trying to get that parameter value, the audio thread could be locked. Or are you saying that the get params value is not going to happen in the audio thread? It's going to happen elsewhere?
Well, it's a bit different. On the top of the process function, there's also a mutex lock. So the audio thread first locks the mutex, then it will process audio, and then release the mutex again. So that means that the GUI thread cannot lock the mutex while the audio thread is processing. And so if you simply do mutex enter, then it will simply wait. So the function of this is, I'm thinking that probably, because get values may be not the worst offender, but set value would be another one. But that's not a good example for clap, because it actually sets your values within your process function. But in VST, that would all run concurrently, and then you have to just protect your because you don't want the parameter to change midway in your processing, because then something, this is not necessarily bad, but it could be bad in certain situations. So,
and is this something that you would have to worry about even for something like a 64-bit floating point?
Well, probably not on a modern CPU, because that the loading 64-bit floating point will be atomic. But still, if you look at this line, this looks like one simple line, but of course it's not one instruction in assembler. So yeah, probably.
Interesting. I guess in JSFX I never have to worry about this, right? Because I never thought about it as an issue before.
No, because in JSFX, I think a single line probably is atomic, but I'm not really sure. But even there, the GUI and the audio thread do run concurrently. So there are some, sometimes you do have to worry about that, even in JSFX.
Well, we had to worry about race conditions between audio thread and user interface a whole lot. But I never worried about it at the level of one variable, because maybe the first half of the double would be set and then the second half wouldn't make sense.
Right. So that's something for all the CPUs that is an issue. So a 32-bit CPU probably has that issue with 64-bit floating points. But modern CPUs don't have that problem. But like I said, it's almost never just a single instruction, because even if this was a constant, then this is still a pointer. A pointer needs to be the reference. That probably will cost one or two instructions. So it's hard to get things to really run atomic. Then you really have to know what's going on assembler level, or you have to force atomic operations using some standard header or something. But this is what came from iPlug original, and so I'm still using that, and it works. So.
All right. Okay. And then value to text, that's pretty straightforward, it seems.
Yeah, one weird thing, what I noticed is that in VST plugins, you can specify a unit for the value in the parameter info function, for example, hertz or dB or whatever. But in clap, you cannot do that. So I have to get that to my string manually here.
Fair enough.
But of course, that's just something. Yeah, it's. I guess it's just what you're used to.
Yeah.
Weird
okay.
thing. I think audio units also has a unit, but clap doesn't. So if you want units, and I did want units, then you have to get them yourself. Okay.
Fair enough. And then text to value.
Yeah, the opposite. So if you type a value, some hosts allow you to do that. I don't think REAPER does in the generic UI, but for example, Bitwig does, so there's a function for that.
Oh, interesting. I wonder if you can type in values outside the range,
Nope.
outside the declared range.
Nope.
Ah, okay.
Now, first of all, clap defines a minimum and maximum in the parameter info, and it's not explicitly stated, but I assume that you should not, the host and the plugin should not go outside of that range. And the other thing is, it's very likely that at some point you will convert that value to a normalized value. And of course, that will also go terribly wrong if you go outside of the range. So
Well, I kind of like the JSFX superpower or bug, however you want to think about it, of allowing you to go outside the range. It is useful at some point, especially in development, but also useful when you have a plugin that you would like to play around with.
yeah, sure. I think it's on purpose, by the way, in JSFX. So there you can do that. Yeah, sure. But here you cannot. So.
All right. Okay.
But of course, by the way, that's up to me. It's not necessarily true because I could reprogram this function to support that if I wanted to. But then I have to. The thing is that I would run into problems and I would have to refactor big parts of iPlug. But that could be done. So clap is not holding you back there, because the user can type in whatever he wants, right? So.
And you get that as a string. That is a bit surprising to me. I was expecting that the host would have to deal with that input and just give you like a number, for instance.
No, so what Bitwig does is it uses the function above to get a string. Then it displays that string in a prompt and you can edit it. And then it just gives that same string back to, or the edited string back to the plugin. And I have to deal with so this could be a number, but it could also be your name or whatever. And I have to deal with that here. Yeah. So there's an upside, but there's also a downside because now I have to parse that and convert it to something useful. And yeah.
Yeah. I think I would prefer for the host to deal with that for me, but I get it because it can be useful for a plugin to allow you to input some arithmetic, for instance. I think that some software allows you to do that. And
yeah, GIMP does, so that would be useful in the plugin as well.
Yeah, I suppose.
And also in my iPlug, I have a function that can map strings to numbers for labels, but you can also type those labels and then it will convert it back to numbers. And that would not be possible if the host would already parse the string. So that's what I'm doing here.
Oh, I see.
So for example, you could define -60 as minus infinity or something. Or 0 as off or something.
Right. It's a bit janky from a user interface perspective, but we are going to build a user interface on top of this anyway.
Yeah, and this is all low level. You have to remember that. So
yeah.
And of course, this is in a framework. So usually you won't want to do this yourself. Usually you will want to use a framework like iPlug or Juice or whatever. And then, of course, you don't have to worry about all this. So it's just because we're looking at the framework code that we're now seeing this. So.
Right. And then it's interesting that we are getting to the end of the file and we are still dealing with parameters. When do we get to deal with audio?
Oh, yeah. Well, that function is probably shorter because you could already see in the get extensions function that how many functions you have to define. So for parameters, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then for state, it's 2. For get audio ports, it's also just 2. But for processing itself, you don't have to define anything because that's one of the core functions, core callbacks. But that's just one function, so we can search for process. Oh, here we see some. This is actually the callback for processing, and that's, like I said, that's defined in the core structure, so that's not an extension. Even though you might not have audio, still you always have a process function. So.
Right, so it seems like when you're doing these extensions, you're not only adding new kinds of messages that the host and plugin understand. Messages
No.
being these functions that you can call. You're not necessarily only extending the language, the messages. You're maybe also extending the parameters that are passed to clap process.
Exactly, because this process function here has a clap process struct. There's a pointer to a process struct. And that contains, for example, the number of inputs. But of course, that is going to be the number of inputs you have specified in your audio ports extension. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. If you don't have an audio ports extension, then that will always be 0. But if you do have an audio ports extension, then it will be 2 or 4 or whatever you're returning.
And in that case, this process that we are talking about here is not just for audio. The same thing will receive MIDI. It will receive, I guess, parameter changes.
Yes, exactly.
They will all go through the same clap process function.
Yeah, and that's very nice because that means there's no concurrency there. So that solves one of the problems that other APIs have, other plugin formats have.
It's a heavy-handed solution, though, because you're serializing the whole thing.
Yeah, that's true. You have to push the queues and all that, and have to push the queues internally, then pass them to the host, which also has to queue them again. So that's true. There's some extra work there. But on the other hand, you can time all your events just like MIDI. So that's why parameters can be sample accurate. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's downsides, but there's also some upsides. I kind of like this way of handling things.
Right. Yeah, okay. I can get behind this. And I guess the downside is that if you are receiving things and trying to process them as they come, which may not be ideal, as you're saying, it's probably better to queue things internally. But if you are trying to process things as they come, and some of the things that you need to process, perhaps audio, takes more time, and other things would be faster, the faster things will have to wait. But I guess it is better than having to synchronize everything yourself.
Yeah, and it's not so bad because you could easily write code that processes a bunch of audio up to the first time index that you have to process some sort of event, then process the event and then return to your audio. So that's pretty easy to do.
Okay. And when we are receiving audio, we are receiving blocks of audio or buffers in pretty much the same way we are used to everywhere else.
Yeah, because what you're looking at here is still not processing audio. Because this code is actually looking at things like tempo changes, that sort of thing, and the song position. This code is actually parsing MIDI events and parameter changes. And those are indeed all the same sort of thing. So that's all events. And only here do we finally start to process audio.
Those are long lines there. Const void, const void.
Yeah, I said it gets fun if you have pointers to pointers to pointers and all that stuff.
Yeah, especially when you have pointers to void. You gotta love those.
Yeah, by the way, I could probably make these lines very short by simply saying void pointer pointer, because I know the C definition in clap is just that. But on the other hand, I know that my inputs are constant, so...
Yeah, and could you have used auto to omit some of these signatures?
Sure. But I tend to not do that because I want to know what type. But the thing with auto is that it leads to things like, oh, it's auto. And then you're going to look up the variable to see what type it is. And
yeah.
And
I see.
This is not templated code or anything. So because for template code, auto is very then I would use it probably. But for this kind of code, I would just type it out. And at least I know what I'm doing and what I'm supposed to be doing.
Fair enough.
For example, auto in this case would not make all these things constant because the definition in clap is not constant. Because in clap, an audio buffer, you can even see that here. You see here the type audio buffer. And an input and an output audio buffer, they're the same type. So clap doesn't know that an input buffer should be constant and an output buffer should not be constant. So There would be subtle differences if I used auto here. But anyway.
Yeah, and I guess if you are writing, auto is convenient, but if you're reading on GitHub, for instance, it's not too convenient, because on an IDE, you could always put your cursor on the right-hand side and it would show you the type. I guess even if you put your cursor on top of the variable name, or maybe even on top of auto, it will show you the type. But on GitHub,
Sure.
we don't have that, so...
Yeah, and I tend to not to use IDEs anyway, so I usually don't see that in my text editor either. So.
Oh, yeah, okay. And I see on line 539 something interesting. You're always processing things in doubles?
Oh, that's something iPlug does, because that's something that Reaper does, and iPlug was made by John Schwartz originally. So yeah, I am.
Interesting. I thought that you would be doing things in float and double depending on the context.
Well, in CLEP I have to, because the host might not support 64-bit. So yeah, then I would have to do that. But I chose to just follow iPlug here, and iPlug originally also had that problem, but they just decided to allocate some temporary buffers so that you can always write your code in doubles and do the conversion last on the fly automatically.
And is that an issue in any way? Because, for instance, Juice tries to lead you into using floats. On the boilerplate, they put the process sample thing in floats. And of course you can change it, but by default it's floats. Do you see the reason why they would be doing this perhaps?
Well, probably because they thought it was faster, and in some contexts it might be faster because you're using less memory if you're using floats, of course. But I always followed Reaper in that aspect, and Reaper says that it's faster doing it in doubles, and also, of course, it's nicer doing it in doubles because some things you have to do in doubles, and then you would have to switch all the time. So. And like I said, iPlug, the original iPlug only did everything in doubles anyway, so I just followed that.
Well, I like that. I prefer having to think about doubles only.
Yeah, of course, like I said, you can't always do that because there will be hosts. I think Bitwig, for example. I think Bitwig doesn't do 64 bits. Not really 100% sure, but I think I saw that. And anyway, there are hosts that do not support it. And then, of course, you have to convert from a float to double, then do your processing, and then convert back. Of course, that is slower. But yeah, it's not that much slower because your processing function will probably do things that are a lot slower than that. So.
Yeah, I guess the way that works is you convert on the way in and convert on the way out, but you never reason about floats internally.
Exactly. And by the way, in CLEP, there's a slight complication here because CLEP actually supports things like float input and doubles output. So the input and output can be, this kind of caught me by surprise in the beginning, but fortunately there's a flag for that. So the plugin can tell the host that it doesn't want that. And of course I have set that flag because I think that's kind of ridiculous. So
it is. Well, it is very flexible and it is principled, but I don't know. It's odd.
It is not too bad because you can still do the same tricks. Just convert when it goes in, and then you don't have to convert when it goes out if it's already 64-bit. So it's not that bad actually, but yeah.
All right. So then we are attaching.
So basically, the process function could have been just these 3 lines if everything was 64-bit, and you already knew that. But all this code above is because I do not know up in front if it will be 64-bit or not. So I can only tell CLEP that I want it to be 64-bit, but I have no guarantee that it will actually be 64-bit. So.
Okay. And then I guess this is all the glue. Is there anything else that we are missing?
Well, not really. There are some details and there's some GUI stuff, of course. But this is the basic function. This is what I wrote first, basically.
And
because you need this to receive MIDI, you need this to process audio, you need this to process parameter changes from the host. So,
and what you're getting from the host in terms of MIDI is pretty much what you get in JSFX. It's just the bytes, and you have to do the parsing yourself.
well, that is possible, but there's also a clap node on, which is not a MIDI node on, because this has velocity and double floating point. And you don't really, again, you can tell clap, I would like to have normal MIDI, please, but you cannot say, there's no guarantee you're getting that. So you have to kind of have to, you can choose not to support this kind of events, but there will be hosts that don't support normal node-ons. So you kind of have to support both versions.
And are they doing this because they expect extensions, like different ways of sending these messages that are not necessarily MIDI?
I'm not really sure. It is true that, of course, floating point for velocity means that you have basically unlimited velocity layers, or at least like 2 to the power 53 layers or something. So that's nice, I guess. But of course, my iPlug doesn't support it. So all I'm doing here is calculating back to a byte and sending that to my iPlug. So.
Okay.
And of course, there's normal MIDI here.
Oh, I see.
That's not just node-ons, of course. That's also pitch bend and control changes and everything.
Right. Okay, I like what I see so far. Can we take a look at the plugin that is using this?
Sure. By the way, because I'm just mimicking VST2, I'm actually going through all the MIDI messages in front of the audio, just like JSFX does, and just handling them there. So that does mean that my plugin will have to queue the MIDI messages again if it wants to process them sample accurate. And of course, I will want to do that. But that's because VST2 also works like that. So.
But is this something that you are not doing right now?
Well, this is something I'm doing purposely just to mimic VST2. So here, this for loop always processes all events for the coming audio block. And then below it processes the audio, just like JSFX does in the block.
Oh, I see.
So this is the block statement, the block section of JSFX, basically. But of course, you don't have to do that, because if you want to make a better plugin, perhaps, then you could do intertwine them and do things sample accurate right here on the spot.
Yeah, I see. So the thing that I was not getting is that you actually don't receive one event when this function is called. You receive a bag of events.
Yes.
Okay.
So you receive all the events that will happen in the next audio block. So
Okay.
if your audio size is 64 samples, then the time index of the events could be 0, could be 1, could be 63, but never higher than that.
Okay. And you are going through all the events, queuing them, and then processing them. But you could be going through the events and processing them.
Well, I'm going through the events and processing them, but I know that my plugin is then queuing them again. Because this is a framework, remember, this is not a plugin. So I don't know what the plugin will want to do with the event, so I'm just passing it on.
Ah, okay.
The only exception is parameters, because in VST parameters can only happen in between blocks anyway, so I mimic that behavior. So the parameters I'm processing directly, and so I might process the same parameter twice in a row with different values. And then the last one is the one
that wins.
Yeah, but of course that would happen anyway. But that means that some parameter changes actually happen too early.
Ah, interesting. You are looking into the future the same way that my plugin was doing yesterday.
Yeah, but I'm guessing actually with VST2 that also happens, because it's basically the same system. The only thing is these things happen in the host, because in VST2 this is not defined in the plugin. This is the host does all this. So, but I'm guessing that the host does the same as what I'm doing here.
It's interesting because clap is giving you all this flexibility and you're like, no, but I'm used to the old way.
Yeah, well, for now I am, because I think it's important to first have plugins that work and then worry about doing it better.
Yeah, and I guess from a plugins perspective, the abstractions are the same. You don't change the way that you use iPlug because you have support for clap now. That's the whole point of having the framework, so that you don't have to worry about this until you perhaps want to use the clap specific extensions. But for
Exactly.
now,
So the first step is mimicking VST2, making sure that it works, and then see from there. Yeah.
okay.
So
It's
yeah,
good to
we can
see
have,
that it's not too hard to take this flexible thing and make it behave like the thing that we are used to.
yeah, most of the things are actually more or less the same, so they make sense. There's only a couple of them that are really different. Like, for example, if you've dragged a slider or a knob in your GUI, then you have to let the host know that the parameter has changed. And in VST2, you can just do a callback on the fly from the GUI thread, and then that's that. But in clap, you have to queue the messages, so that's really different. But of course, that's not a huge problem, because that just means you have to keep a queue of events that you have to send to the host at the right moment. Yeah.
And do you think that perhaps the user interface and the audio processing could happen in separate places and communicate via this queue?
Yeah, so the thing is, with VST2, it's not exactly clear how this is supposed to synchronize. So we now know how it works because hosts have implemented it in a certain way, and plugins know that and also implement it in that way, but it was never really clear from the documentation. And of course, what clap does is very clear, because you have to supply a bunch of events in your process function to the host if you want the parameters to change. So then it's very clear that nothing else can happen at the same time because your process function is running. So
fair enough. Okay.
And also the output parameters can then again have a timing index, so you can do it sample accurate, which is something you cannot do in VST2 because you're calling the host callback from the GUI thread. So and the moment you do that, any precise timing is out of the window. So
yeah, I remember running into problems of that nature when doing my waveform visualizer component. Things getting out of sync because of this. Right. Can we look at the plugin using this, the example plugin using this?
Sure.
And Bo is saying here on the chat, I suggested the inputs of arithmetic to Justin Frankel. I use it all the time in Adobe products, and it's really handy. Yeah, and it's not something you can do in Reaper, and you cannot do it in most software, but it is a convenient thing.
So I would welcome it. I use it in GIMP all the time, actually. Okay, so this is the header file of my example plugin, iPlug plugin. It's just a simple tremolo effect. Mm-hmm. You might recognize some of the things from your C++ study group.
Yeah, and I hope that Bo recognizes this too, because it is the kind of code that we were writing together.
Yeah, by the way, now I can finally explain. No, you don't have to say is 0 because that's the default. But I guess it's kind of good practice because now you know for sure that it's starting at 0. You don't have to worry about it or look it up or whatever. And then from that point on, it will just auto-increment with 1. So this one will be 1, and the depth will be 2, and the shape will be 3. And then, of course, the number of parameters is 4, which is correct.
Yeah, it happens to be correct, which is a cute little trick that we have a similar thing in the code that we are writing when we are defining data structures. But yeah, is there a reason for you to use bare enums instead of the class enums in C++?
Well, the class enums are a new feature, and I tend to not really use new features if old features still work.
Fair enough.
But remember, iPlug is 15 years old or something. At least 10 years old, probably 12 or 13. To be
And
precise.
are there newer features in C++ that you think are worth including and are worth perhaps some rewriting? Or do you think that it's okay to just ignore them?
Yeah, I think it's okay to just ignore them, and but use whatever you want to use. So if you want to use those new features, do it, because there's nothing wrong with them. But I don't think it's necessary to rewrite something that works just because there is another way of doing it. By the way, this is a new feature I do use all the time, and I think it's very useful. It's telling your compiler that this header has been included for the source file it's in, and doesn't have to include it again should you include it again. Because some headers will include each other, and of course you don't want an infinite loop of headers. So the traditional way of protecting against that was to say if def and then define some sort of unique symbol. But now you don't have to do that anymore for a long time, and you can just write this. So that's a feature I will definitely always use. So it just depends.
As for me, I'm looking forward to newer C++, I guess 2022 features that will subsume or maybe render not as useful the concept of header files in general. And then we wouldn't need this pragma once shenanigans, because it is a bit awkward.
Yeah, you're talking to mostly a C guy, so for me it's very natural to have files. Yeah, so I don't mind them. But so anyway, the other code is pretty simple. But what we're basically doing here is defining a bunch of methods that we're overriding in this effect. So there's not much to see here. So if we switch over to the actual source file, here I'm including my own header, so we have access to everything we just saw. And then here, again, we see some things that are probably somewhat familiar, but also somewhat different, because I'm doing things a little different than the original iPlug. But basically, I'm again saying, hey, there's a parameter, it's called bypass. The default value is false because it's a Boolean parameter. And I'm doing that for every parameter.
I see. Yeah, okay. Most of this looks reasonable to me. You're setting ranges, you're setting names, I guess units for other formats that are not clap, that support units as a first-class citizen.
My clap supports units because I edit them myself, so.
Yeah, and then we have the notion of presets. That's okay. Even if you don't want to use presets, I guess you need one.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. With clap, that's still something I'm not sure about, but clap doesn't have presets, I think. Not at all. So I'm not sure what's up with that, but. So this probably does. So for the thing is, for VST, this creates a couple of presets. And in VST2, presets are mostly, you can edit them on the fly, switch between them, and then go back and edit them some more. So they're all editable. But in out, they're all read-only. They're factory presets. But in clap, they're not there at all. And I haven't found an extension for presets, so I'm not sure. I guess there are no presets.
Interesting. Do you think that perhaps they're relying on the host to make sense of presets?
Yeah, that could be, because that's a thing you could do. One of the things I noticed is that VST2 has the concept of a plugin state and plugin bank, which means a single preset or a bank of presets. And that's just something that, for example, audio units also doesn't have, and clap certainly doesn't have. So, but it doesn't matter, because you can still define this. Your VST will have them, your audio unit will have them, your clap won't have them.
Okay.
And the same goes for all the presets here, up to here.
Make preset from named params. Is it on? Question mark. Good stuff there.
Yeah, and then there's some GUI code. This is, by the way, where my iPlug version is really different from iPlug 2. Because I'm still doing things the traditional way, so to speak. So this is just defining the GUI size, setting some flags, and loading some images, or rather defining some images, because we're not loading them yet. So
you are defining the image, then you are loading the image, and then you are plotting the image? Is that how you reason about images?
yeah, kind of. But the thing is, here we only defining images, nothing more than that. Because the thing is, iPlug used to load images here, I think. But the problem is, this is the constructor. So even if you scan the plugin, this will get executed, and then it would load all the images, which is kind of slow. So right now I'm just defining images here, just saying how big they are and that they are there and where they should be used. But I'm not actually loading or plotting them or anything yet.
Okay.
So this is more or less compositing the GUI, just defining where everything goes and what kind of controls there are and if there should be visible initially or not. Or
why would that be in the constructor if you're saying that the constructor would be called even when just verifying the plugin without running the plugin for real?
Yeah. That's a good question. Well, I would say because that was already there in iPlug before even I touched it. But I think it's also convenient because that means the GUI is available from this point on. So that if you dereference it in another function, it's available. Because else, for example, if a parameter change happens, you might want to update some other GUI control. But if the GUI is not yet there, if it's just a null pointer, then you have to check and worry about it. So it's kind of convenient to have it here already. But
okay.
that is somewhat inefficient in the sense that you wouldn't really have to do all this work while scanning the plugin, and now you do have to do that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I guess I would probably separate this into two parts. The first is the constructor, and that is only doing the bare minimum that would be necessary when you're loading the plugin for verification. Then a second step that you would, I guess it is similar to the prepare for audio in Juice, for instance. It's just another thing that you need to call before you can actually run the plugin. And that would do the user interface thing. But, well, okay, whatever.
Yeah, and then we have some boilerplate code because my plugins nowadays support Retina images. So I have to know if they're the normal size or the double size or half the size or full size, whatever way you want to look at it.
Yeah, that's something that I never understood. There are all these platforms that I am not so familiar with, from iOS, Android to desktop applications. They seem to like this notion of having multiple images. And it's even something that some people do on the web, the platform that I'm most familiar with. But I don't really see the point. Why don't you just have the high resolution image, and if you are on Retina, scale it down?
Well, you could do that, but then of course it wouldn't look as good. So that's the simple reason. And also there is a second reason actually, because my old iPlug plugins, so the existing plugins basically, didn't have a Retina support. So they would load much larger images and would be much heavier on resources than they used to be. And I don't want to upset current users, so that's another reason. But the biggest reason is that it's hard to downsize images nicely. So you could probably do it, but then it would cost a lot of CPU if you want it to look nice. So the easier way is just to do everything twice, because then you can do that offline and render it in very high quality. Maybe use an even higher resolution source.
Okay.
So it's actually the coward's way out, because it's just easier to get good results. But of course there is a downside, because it makes switching less easy, because you have to load all the images again. Yeah.
Oh, so if your plugin is running on a computer that has two displays, one Retina, one not, then you try and drag the plugin from one window to the other, and it needs to load a bunch of things.
Yes, and it will do that, and you see it switch over when you're more than halfway across the screen. Yeah.
Fun. Okay.
So if you're just in between, it will keep the old size. But if you just drag it a little further, you see it switch over. Yeah, sure.
And when you're actually doing these images, not for this simple example, but for your real commercial plugins, do you do anything other than resizing? Do you have to change the interface on these kinds of displays?
Well, I do mostly what I do here, load other images. But the thing is, I have some other routines that will alert the controls that the size has changed. So then each control can also execute some code to adapt to the new size.
Yeah, but I was thinking more of in terms of like user interface. Are there buttons that need to be repositioned or this sort of thing?
No. Well, I try not to do that. I try to make everything exactly. But the thing is, I'm only supporting like half size and full size. But on Windows, for example, you could also have 150% size. So that's like 1.5 times the size. And then I do use the big versions and downscale them. So in that case, I would downscale. But
Okay.
I'm not repositioning anything. I'm just drawing the same GUI. But that's not something that iPlug dictates. That's just something I do because you could do that. Because this is a callback basically, so your plugin could do all sorts of things here if you want to display a totally different GUI if you want.
Yeah, I don't think that it would be terribly useful, but I get it.
Well,
okay.
During development, I sometimes do that. I purposely make everything red in one of the versions just so I can see which version is currently loaded. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, then we have some parameters. When they change these callbacks, here gets called, and then you can query the values or do whatever you need to do. So it's here. It's not doing much, but it's just storing the values, doing some simple calculations.
Okay, that's my sample section in JSFX. No, not my sample, my slider section.
Exactly, this is the slider section. Yeah. The only difference, of course, is that the slider section usually handles all parameters one by one, but this one gets called for a very specific parameter, one at a time.
Yeah. Okay. And all of this looks very familiar because we have looked at code that is using iPlug 2 and not much has changed.
Some things have changed, but I'm sure that some things are also exactly the same. Yeah, sure. And then we have something that I think the original iPlug didn't have, a set separate callback, because I've added this a while ago. This gets called when the separate changes, and when the plugin is initialized, it gets the first separate, of course.
I'm trying to make sense of this. You were calculating the smooth coefficients of things that have to do with this plugin, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess in JSFX, I just take for granted that the sample rate will hopefully not change. Please don't change the sample rate under my plugins.
Exactly, because in JSFX, of course, the whole init section will normally be called again if the sample rate changes. So.
Yeah, and in my experience, it is called again, but the cute thing is that in the documentation, they say it will probably be called again, but don't rely on this too much. And I'm like, I am relying on it.
Yeah, but so here there is a very specific call that gets called when the sample rate changes. And it only gets called when it actually changes. So the plugin doesn't have to worry about checking if the sample rate has actually changed, because you already know it has when it gets to this code.
Okay.
So I'm calculating all things that are dependent on the sample rate here. That's basically what I'm doing. And then we have a reset. It's kind of unclear when this is actually called because it kind of depends on the host as well. But generally speaking, this will be called either on start of playback or stop of playback. So that's a good place to reset things like phases of your oscillators or whatever.
Okay. And then process double replacing. That will be processing samples represented as double floating point numbers. And
yes, and look, we have pointers to pointers again.
oh yeah, lovely. Const double star const star const inputs, of course.
While your input is constant all the way. That's what it says.
But the word replacing to me implies that you would be receiving a buffer and you would be replacing that buffer with the outputs. But that's not what's happening. We have an inputs and outputs.
That is true. However, VST2 used to have a function just called process, I think, because this is before VST 2.4. So I have never worked with that, but I know it had a function process, and that would get only a single pointer. So you have to read from that buffer and then write in that buffer as well. And so this function process replacing is to differentiate this function, which has an input and an output buffer, from that other function. But that other function has fortunately been is now obsolete. So
okay, why do you say that's a good thing? Because that's the model we have in JSFX, and it sort of works.
Well, the thing is, if you're careful, you might. The thing is, most hosts will use different buffers for in and output, and that's nice because that means you can render things in the output buffer temporarily, for example, without overwriting your input. And else you wouldn't be able to do that. So, and I think it's probably also more efficient because now it can use the output of the previous effect, use that pointer as inputs, and new pointer as outputs, and then just probably swap them around every other effect or something. But I think it's an efficiency thing. And anyway, it's something that VST used to do and no longer does. And so actually, maybe I should have renamed this just to process, because that would have been so much easier. But because the whole replacing and the whole double, it's always double. It's always replacing. So yeah.
Well, hang on. You're not. I'm very confused about many things you said there. First, this idea of swapping inputs and outputs. If you had just one buffer that you read and write to, then you wouldn't need to swap at all. You would just wait for one plugin to finish and pass that same buffer to the next.
I didn't explain that correctly. The thing is that the process function from the old VST, I think 2.3 or something, there you could just do nothing in your process function because the input is also the output. So if your plugin did nothing, it didn't have to fill the output buffer because it's the same as the input buffer, and so it's already filled. But this function needs to always fill the output buffer, even if it wants to do nothing. And I think that's why it's called process replacing, because it's replacing the contents of the output buffer, which of course would be undefined when you come into this function. But that's, I think, why Steinberg chose this name in the first place. And iPlug just copied that name, but I guess that's kind of silly now because there is only process double replacing. There's nothing else. So
yeah, that is, of course, historical, but I don't know. People that were designing this thought exactly the opposite of what I thought. When he says replacing, I am assuming that you are giving me something and I'm going to replace in place, not in another output buffer that is initially
exactly
unspecified.
Replacing is not in place, exactly. And I guess you would have come up with better names than they did, because
probably not. If I was in their shoes, I would probably be making up these kinds of things as well. It's very easy to critique with the benefit of hindsight. Anyway, so you receive your inputs and you need to produce your outputs, and n frames is just the counter of how many frames you have.
Yes.
That's easy enough. And then you call the default pass-through.
Yeah, the thing is, I check if the plugin actually has received sample rate and block size, because that's something that at least in VST2 is not well defined. So there could be a host that fails to call one of these. And of course, then that would crash if I would continue processing. So
I see. Okay. And
so this
then,
is just a check. You don't have to do that if you're feeling lucky, but it's probably good practice.
okay. And then there is this treatment of denormalized numbers that is very interesting. It's something that exists in iPlug too, or exists in Juice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this is just something that sets the modern CPU flags so that you don't have to worry about denormals. And then because this is a C++ class, it will destruct itself on the end of the function. So it will then recover the flags back to their original state.
Yeah. By the way, why would you want that? Why would you want to disable this denormalization protection?
It's not protection, it's the other way around. The flags make sure that a denormal number gets treated as if it were 0, which is a much faster way. But of course, it's also dangerous, because if you divide by it, then you'll be doing a divide by 0. But so this is faster, because then you don't have to worry about denormals. And another flag is that if the outcome of a calculation would be a denormal, then the CPU will also automatically set it to 0. So those are the two flags it basically sets, and that's useful because then you don't have to worry about them basically.
Yeah, but I guess my question is, when is it useful to compute with the denormals precisely without flushing them to 0?
Yeah. So suppose we're doing a calculation and the number gets very small, and then you do 1 divided by that number. If denormals are still enabled, then of course that will still work and will just produce a very large number. But if denormals are flushed to 0, then you're dividing 1 by 0.
Fair enough.
So it's precision. Denormals are not only if we're doing audio DSP, then we think of denormals as something of a nuisance, but they also very useful because you can store very, very, very small numbers that way. So.
Yeah, okay. And then we get to some actual processing that is done with the effect. There is a YouTube link there. Is that a video of you doing the coding for this plugin?
Well, I think it's because I'm using the name tau is 2pi here. And there's a flame war between math people, between some people prefer pi, 2pi, and others prefer tau. So this is probably the video about that flame war, I guess. So that's just an in-joke.
Okay, I will need to check that later. I just took a screenshot of this because I need to watch this. Okay, and then you are doing the tremolo. You are doing an LFO, and you are taking that as the amplitude, multiplying the waveform coming in by this.
Exactly. So then it's just boring tremolo code that we would also do in JSFX or whatever.
Okay, okay. And you are doing the LFO yourself. So that's another question I have. iPlug comes with some facilities for drawing, and of course it does the smoothing of the different APIs from VST2 to clap and audio units. But in terms of core blocks of digital signal processing, something that would do an LFO, something that perhaps would do tremolo, or maybe something that would do filters and that sort of thing. Does iPlug have any for that?
Nope, nothing. Well, almost nothing, because we do have things like the denormal fix, but that's actually not from iPlug, but from Whittle. So, by the way, that's just in case you haven't set the denormal flags. But indeed, iPlug does not contain any DSP, so you're supposed to do that yourself or make your own library or use some library or whatever.
Okay. Not even FFTs? Even JSFX has FFTs.
Yeah, but Whittle does. So,
okay.
And you need Whittle anyway for iPlug, so it does make sense to use some of the Whittle stuff. Whittle also contains a reverb and some other stuff. Of course, you can use that. But you can also use that if you're not using iPlug. So you can also use the Whittle FFT if you're using Juice, of course. So.
Okay, okay. We do have some questions here on the chat. So let's see. Mage says, do we know the rough percentage of pro plugin developers that currently use Juice / iPlug / other frameworks or develop their own solutions?
Well,
do you know
not
what
that
the market share looks like?
I have really no idea. I do know that there are a lot of developers that do their own homebrew framework, because if they started long ago, then there was no iPlug and there was no Juice. So those developers will probably use their own framework. Then again, some may have jumped ship, of course. So, but I guess Juice is the most used anyway. But I don't know what percentages. No idea.
Yeah, and I guess perhaps big houses would prefer to, I don't know, maybe they would prefer to not use Juice because then they have to pay for Juice and blah, blah, blah. But it may be advantageous because many people know Juice already, so it would be easier to hire people.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know. But I think that many small shops are using Juice, and iPlug is less used. But I don't think that many small shops are developing their own thing.
No, because that does take a lot of time. I know, because I am doing that. So
Yeah, you can tell firsthand.
Also, I think a lot of people do want to code DSP, but don't want to code all this GUI stuff and API stuff. So that's, of course, a valid way of doing things. So then you definitely want to use some sort of existing framework.
Yeah. And Martin is here. Hello, Martin. And they say the clap can have 32-bit audio input and 64-bit audio output. Yes.
Yeah, what I explained, yeah.
Yeah, it is crazy, isn't it? And Mage is saying, with a fully const input, I suppose the same block can be passed to multiple parallel plugins.
Oh yeah, that's you see, there are reasons for doing it this way. So yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
At the same time on different cores. Yeah, so that's very advantageous for the host. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I think that's kind of an edge case, but I can see why that would be useful. And in Reaper, it's not even possible, because you cannot say that plugins are in parallel. If you route them in parallel, perhaps Reaper could figure it out, but it's not like Ableton that has a first-class notion of parallel processing.
Yeah, still, it's also a bit, I think the interface is a bit cleaner if you have constant inputs and outputs that you generate, because it's very clear who has to do what. So
yeah.
Also, that's also the interface Clap uses, of course. So and our audio units, by the way. So yeah.
And did you ever look into VST3?
Well, not in much detail. It's still on my to-do list also to add, but that's not going to be so easy probably, because the VST3 SDK is really an SDK and not just an API. So either you have to extract just the API from it, which is probably what I would do, or you have to just accept the full SDK and do it their way.
Interesting. So it is easier to add support for Clap than it is to add support for VST3.
Yeah, sure. And probably also easier to add Clap support than AAX support, again for the same reason.
Fair enough. Interesting. I didn't know that. Right. So there are a couple of things that I still want to look at. One of which is the GUI. So we talked about that whole notion of Swell and LICE. Can we see some of that?
Sure. That's not in the plugin, by the way, because the plugin just loads the images, creates controls, and this plugin only creates standard controls that are in iPlug, so it doesn't do any custom controls. So that makes it kind of easy. So it does. The plugin does supply a bunch of images here. Well, it's not really useful to look at them individually, probably, but there's a bunch of PNG files that you have to link with your binary.
Do you want to perhaps just open the plugin real quick so we can see what it looks like?
I could do that. Oh, better even. I could build the plugin and show you that.
Yeah, I was also interested in asking you about the build system because you said that you have, first of all, you don't use IDEs, and I would like to see what your development environment looks like.
Sure. So I'm running a standard, well, not exactly standard. I'm using the Visual Studio command prompt in Windows here. And this is a directory listing of my of the iPlug example that I'm using to test iPlug with, which is basically the iPlug example, more or less. Let's open it in the Explorer. So that's here. And here you can see the iPlug example code we just looked at. But you also see Whittle here, and iPlug itself, and clap headers. And so usually I will open the source code in Notepad++, or another text editor, but usually this. So I will just edit source code here. And then when I think I'm done and I'm ready to build the plugin, I will switch to the command prompt. And then I will just type something like make clap, because that will build the clap version. And so we're now building the clap version from scratch, because I cleaned my build environment before before this session. So now it's building, and now it's ready. Basically, now I have a clap version of the plugin.
And this make thing, I'm not sure I know about it. Is it like make in the Linux environment?
Yeah, but not exactly. It's Microsoft's version of make. So the actual syntax is similar but very different inside the files, which is kind of confusing sometimes.
And do you write the make files by hand?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Yeah, so here I have a make file set up that's also supplied with the example. So this is just something I made by hand because I'm quite familiar with the Microsoft compiler anyway, and with all the options. And there, of course, you can Google them. So
okay.
Yeah, so this is just something I set up, and I've even set up that the clap version doesn't only build the clap version, but it also copies it to a location where Reaper will be able to find it. This is, by the way, something the default example does not do, because I don't know if someone is using Reaper or not. So I know I am using Reaper. So, but now we should be able to load the plugin in Reaper. Let's see if it's there.
Nice stuff.
Oh, it is. Yay, it is. Oh yeah, that's my custom splash screen. Yeah, so this is the plugin we just built.
And these are components that you get out of the box with iPlug.
Yeah, so there's a component that can use a stack, image stack for a knob like this. And likewise, there's a component that can just use a static image that you can drag up and down for this kind of sliders.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there is a component that can do a simple switch.
Yeah, but unlike other frameworks, there is no default look and feel for an iPlug.
Oh, no,
plugin.
No, it's very back to basics. And if you want to do anything fancy, then you have to first code it yourself. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So, and for some of my bigger projects, I will actually extend that makefile a bit. So if I quickly switch to Keybase, this is something I can also do. When I've created a makefile that supports, let's do run, that's even better. I've made a makefile that mimics the sort of behavior you see on Linux a lot, where you can do make install and make run. And I can do that with plugins as well. And this should build the VST2 version now. But then it should also switch back to Reaper automatically. Yeah. So now all I have to do is load Keybase.
Very nice.
And then I can remove it again, switch back to Notepad++, do some editing, switch back to the prompt, just run it again. So that's basically what I'm usually doing.
Very back to the basics, very clean environment. I like that.
The only problem, of course, is when I want to debug something, I don't have a debugger running because I'm not in an IDE. So then I have to make do with other solutions. But of course, there's solutions for that. So,
What do you use?
Oh, on Mac OS, I just log to the console. But on Windows, you have to do another thing. But I will show you, because we can add a debug message just for fun. So let's add some debug message to the constructor here. So this should display, or at least send a debug message. And I have to. I did Command S to save, but of course I'm not really on a Mac. I forgot.
Yeah. So you usually use a Windows machine, but then you have a Mac as well?
Yeah, because I'm developing on Windows most of the time, but I also have a Mac when I have to build a Mac version or test the Mac version.
And what we are looking at right now is your Windows computer, but you are accessing it from your Mac computer using some kind of virtual console kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm just using remote desktop. That's a standard feature on Windows machine, and there's an app for it on Mac. So let's see, because now I should be able to.
But you're only doing this because of the stream. You usually don't do it that way, right?
Oh, usually I'm behind my Windows machine, but the Mac is actually MacBook, so it has a onboard webcam, and it's actually pretty nice to use. So for streams, I usually use this. So I've now rebuilt the clap version with the debug message, hopefully. So let's see. If I now load the clap version of the iPlug example, yay, it says plug hello. And so the nice thing is you can print all sorts of information here. And this also supports things like if you want to print a number or something, just the normal C, C++ printf format is supported, so you can very easily debug small messages. Of course, you don't want to do this in your process function, because then there will be a lot of messages, but...
Fair, yeah. So this debug view, it is something that comes with Windows? I don't know that.
No, unfortunately not, and it doesn't come with Visual Studio either, but it's made by a former employee of Microsoft, and you can just download it for free.
Okay, and it is attaching to a separate process and collecting messages.
Yeah, under the hood, it's actually doing this. It's called. This is the Win API function that actually prints to a string to that console log. But that can only do raw strings. So iPlug has a function that can handle printf format and then convert it to a raw string and then print it there. Unless, of course, you're on Mac OS, then we'll send it to the console and actually do nslog. Yeah.
Okay. But you are not able to necessarily stop the process in the middle and then step debug.
No, but if I have to do that, I can still do that, because I can start Visual Studio, and then of course I can
okay, yeah,
break in, and so that's still possible. So you don't have to build with Visual Studio to use the debugger. In other words.
Nice. Yeah, I tend not to find step debugging too useful, I must say.
No, it's only when you have a crash it's actually useful, because then you can see where it crashes. That's nice.
Yeah, but for one reason or another, I keep going back to just printing stuff, because maybe you are in a loop, or maybe there is some kind of race condition. Any bug that is interesting enough that you would like to step debug, you cannot. I find that.
Now, and also if you're not building in debug mode, then it's very hard to step debug, because the compiler might optimize some things away. So in other words, if I would set a breakpoint on this line might not actually be executed, because the compiler might have a better way of combining all these or something. And so then this line doesn't exist, and so your breakpoint doesn't fire. So you have to build in debug mode to debug, but then of course your problem won't show.
Yeah, that's
so
what I find too.
Yeah, I tend to always build release builds and just do this, print some debug info.
Yeah, that's my style too. I appreciate your style there. And when it comes to editing text in Notepad++, I have no experience doing that, but I assume that there is very little in terms of, I want to say, like IDE-like features, things like jumping to definition, finding all occurrences of variable and that kind of thing?
Well, maybe there is actually, but I'm not using it. So I do like the colors because I think that helps. But I find it irritating if I type and it starts to already assume that I mean something, but of course I don't mean. So then, yeah, I don't like that. So I'm not using that. But I think there are some extensions for Notepad++ that do that sort of thing. But probably not as good as an IDE would do it. So
That's very interesting. People who have this kind of mindset, I would expect, would use something like Emacs or Vim, not Notepad++. I
well, I also do use VIM now and then because if you have to do something in Git, like edit a commit message or something, so I will do this, and then I'm not using Notepad++, but just using VIM that comes with Git. Yeah, sure.
Fair enough. You occupy a very unique space there. There are people who are using full-blown IDEs. There are people who are using bare-bones text editors. And I guess you're using bare-bones text editors, but you are in this different space.
Oh, I just did a stupid thing because I have no insert key on this keyboard, and now I can't exit VIM.
How do you usually exit Vim? Vim. I usually say Vim. How do you usually exit?
Now I've found it already, but now I have trouble commenting out this line, but I'll just delete it because I'm actually editing iPlug repository, so I don't really want to do that, I think.
Yeah, but you can always exit without...
Yeah, but I forgot what the key for that is.
So I guess you want first delete that line, right? So
yeah, that's what I should have done, but I couldn't do that because I'm missing insert keys and other keys on this keyboard. So,
but you could always type DD. That is going to delete a line.
I should have done that, but it doesn't matter because I can just reset to the original version.
Yeah.
Let's just.
Yeah, I was gonna say remember to input minus hard.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you could also have typed D down arrow or DJ. Anyway, the classic, how do you exit Vim? We have people here on the chat commenting on that. M9 is here. Hello. And they say, I never use step debug. I just log things. Yeah, same here. I mean, it is nice to perhaps explore a bunch of low-level algorithms when you're doing something like how does quicksort work. Then I think that step debugging is helpful, but most of the time I don't use it. And Justin Johnson is here. I said hello in the chat, but I'm going to say hello now again. And they say that they use both debug log for tracking on the fly and step debugging when things have gone horribly wrong, like after a significant refactor. Also tracking exceptions and looking at the call stack is useful.
Yeah, sure. And also, if I really need to step debug some bit of C or C++ code, I tend to isolate the code. So just copy paste it in a new file and just run it in isolation on the command line or something.
Yeah, and Mage is saying, remember, column QW. I disagree. Column WQ.
Oh, yeah.
Or I guess in that case, I guess if you have done the Q exclamation mark, no, it would exit without saving, but it would still create the commit. Anyway, an empty commit message would have been the right solution, I think.
That is what I was trying to do, but I was trying to type a dash symbol before the line, but that somehow doesn't work because I'm using remote desktop. So
yeah, you can always do I or capital I to insert on the start of the line and then put the comment there. Anyway, let's see some of the code for the LICE and SWELL things, because I'm interested in seeing some Win32 API. I don't think I have seen that.
No, you haven't, because that's in a separate iPlug file. And of course, that code is all the same for VST2 and CLAP. So
no, what I'm saying is I don't think I have seen that in my life.
Oh, yeah, that's possible. You could have looked it up if you wanted to. Yeah. Actually, you're probably going to be disappointed, but because there's probably not a lot here. But so this is the basic graphics code for iPlug, the sort of code that doesn't depend on the OS.
Before we start diving into this, can you paint us the picture, the high-level view of how the PCs are put together? Because we have Whittle, Swell, LICE, iPlug, and then your plugin. And I have a fair notion of how the audio processing works, but I have no idea how the graphics are organized.
Well, there is a sort of abstract class iGraphics that basically contains things like open window, that creates the plugin window, but also things like that handles mouse input for the whole window, not per controller, for the whole window. And then it figures out which control is the topmost and should receive the mouse event, and then it sends the event to that control. So that's basically handling all controls. So sort of like a window manager or control manager.
Okay.
And then there are different versions of iGraphics for the different OSs. So there's a version for Windows here, and this does the actual drawing to the screen. And this needs to be specifically for Windows, because Windows, of course, draws to the screen differently than macOS does. So this contains all the sort of Win API calls and whatnot.
Okay, so to reiterate, your plugin is in charge of the things like which images to draw. It is in charge of any high-level interactivity that the plugin does, like, for instance, my, I guess, now infamous waveform display that I did in JSFX. I would do that at the plugin level, or maybe some other library on top of iPlug. Then yes. iPlug is giving me iGraphics, which has very bare-bone things like where did the click happen.
Yeah, well, it has a little more, because there is a concept of controls. There's a collection of controls that you have to define in iPlug. So, and a control is actually just a rectangle. And it could be a rectangle that draws something, but it could also be a rectangle that doesn't actually draw anything, but just receives mouse input. But so the screen is divided in controls, and these controls can have an X and Y coordinate, and they have an order, kind of a Z order. So they're on top of one another. Okay,
so to that extent, it's similar to what we have been building in JSFX in my own little library. And then what is LICE doing?
Well, let's go back to the universal part of iGraphics, and let's just find LICE. So, for example, LICE is handling loading of images, because my iPlug only supports PNG images, but they have to be loaded. And they have to be loaded to some sort of universal memory format, because the different Windows and Mac OS have a different way of handling that. So, and that's something that LICE takes care of.
Okay.
So, for example, you see a LICE bitmap. That's a sort of universal bitmap memory version of the bitmap of the image. But LICE also does things like drawing some simple primitives. Let's see if we can find one, because this is all bitmaps, and bitmaps. I can't even find one directly. That's probably because they were so simple that I put them in a header file, I guess. Or maybe because I accidentally searched only for bitmaps. Could be. Let's see what we have. We have draw line or something. Yeah, so here we have draw line. Oh, it is in the source file. Okay. Sometimes I forget what is where. Also because I moved around things. So, yeah. So here's a simple routine that can draw a line. I usually, this is similar to graphics line in JSFX. And here it's called a LICE function. So this is a LICE function. But it isn't that different from the JSFX graphics line function. The big difference is that I have to give it a bitmap, similar to the graphics image, no graphics dest variable in JSFX.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just coordinates and some flags. So it's quite similar.
Okay, so LICE is giving us the some of the drawing capabilities, some of the images. And then what is Swell doing?
Well, on Windows, Swell is seriously doing nothing at all. It's just there's it checks if it's on Windows, and if it is, then it just includes the standard Windows header, and that's it. But on macOS, it will capture things like a message box, for example. That's a Win API function that can display a message box. But you can just call that Win API function on macOS, and then it will display a macOS message box. But that's actually not something that is specifically for iPlug. That's just something that Swell does.
Okay, so Swell is doing some of the, I guess LICE would be using Swell to some extent?
Yeah, exactly. And maybe iGraphics also, I can't remember. But there are other places where I use Swell because I'm calling Win API functions. So this is the Swell internals inside of Whittle.
Yeah, and I guess Whittle is the last part of the picture that I'm trying to paint here. So both LICE and Swell are part of Whittle.
Yes.
Okay, and you have your own fork of iPlug, but it seems like you also have your own fork of Whittle.
Yeah, I do. But by the way, iPlug used to also be part of Whittle, but at some point it was removed. So, well, I cannot find the message box definition for macOS quickly enough. Oh, I did find it. So message box is just a standard Win API function. So on Windows you can just call it because it's always there, because Windows provides that. But on macOS, of course, that doesn't exist. And so what Cocos did is they made a fake message box for Linux and for macOS. And this is the macOS version. So basically it just calls some macOS. Apparently it runs NSRun alert panel to simulate a message box.
Yeah, and that whole thing of the different options you can pass to message box, that all looks familiar to me because of Reaper scripts.
Yeah, because that, of course, also uses a lot of these things, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're using a message box there and you're running on macOS, then you're also using Swell.
Yeah, so I guess I stand corrected. I said before that I didn't see any Win32 APIs in my life, but I guess I did because of REA scripts.
Yeah. But yeah, I do also have my own Whittle fork with some changes to the original, but you can choose which one you want to use. So my iPlug does also work with the Whittle version from Cocos.
Okay, what did you change in your version of Whittle?
Oh, I don't know. I'm now beginning to think maybe it doesn't work with the Cocos Whittle anymore, because I'm thinking I have added a header file to deal with byte order. This is not a thing anymore, but a few years back there were Power Macs, and they used big endian numbers. But all Intel machines use little endian numbers, so that was an issue when you're saving your plugin state and swapping it across machines. So I've added a header, but that header is probably required by iPlug, so you have to use my Whittle, I guess. So that's one of the things I added. But I probably did a lot of small other changes as well. I'd have to search the Git history as well, because I don't remember anymore.
But it seems like you're still tracking, given the commit message that we see on the screen, it seems like you're still tracking the upstream.
I'm following Cocos 100%. So I've changed things, added things that I needed. And often then a few years later, Cocos will add something similar but slightly different. And then I will just switch to their version because it's easier. It's tested by more people. So.
Okay.
And sometimes I send patches back, of course, because the real FFT in JSFX is because I added real FFT support to the FFT from Whittle, and that's how that ended up in JSFX. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Are there other claims to fame that we should know about?
Probably not. No, sometimes we swap out patches. Sometimes I get an email with some change that is interesting. Sometimes I just see a change myself, but there's not that much that I specifically made. So.
Okay, and do you think that there is more user interface code that it would be interesting to see, even if it's not related to CLAP necessarily?
Well, we could have a quick look in the, for example, the Windows, because you said you saw so little Win API code. So this is the implementation of iGraphics, and so this is the code that actually draws things to the screen, and there's probably some call for that. Let's see. Yeah, so this is a very Windows-specific routine, draw screen, that draws the actual blitz, the memory bitmap. So when you're drawing things in iPlug, it's actually blitting them in memory. And then when you're done, that memory is blitted to the actual screen. And this routine does the blitting to the screen. And so in the Mac version, there's also a version of draw screen, but that has a different contents because you have to do things differently there. So this is what actually blitz the, you can see here, bitblit is the Win API function that actually copies everything we've drawn to the actual screen.
So you have literally a loop that is going pixel by pixel?
No, there's a loop in iPlug that goes control by control. So every control, starting with the background and then moving up. And then it checks if the control is visible and if it's part of the rectangle that we want to update, because we don't always necessarily update the whole screen. And then it draws that in memory on top of one another. And when it's done all that, then it blits it to the screen. But of course, the LICE parts that do the that draw the bitmaps in memory, yeah, of course they have to copy the big pixels. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And the source code is in WDL for that. So that's not, there are no API functions in that. It's just swapping memory around in smart ways, copying memory. Yeah.
That's kind of scary. I'm scared by that kind of low-level operation.
But of course, that also happens if you run Reaper and if you use JSFX, because in the end, somebody has to blit it to the screen. I guess there are also slightly more modern APIs to do this. Of course, you could also use something like OpenGL or something. But
yeah, and this is not something that exists in iPlug, right? I don't think you can try to render your user interface in the GPU, or even, can you like vectorize some digital signal processing?
No, not in my iPlug. But I think you can in iPlug too. I think there are some options to do different render, use a different render system. So
yeah, I know that you can use different drawing backends, and I guess some of them are on the GPU, but I was asking about the bare bones LICE and I guess Swell. Well, not really in this case, it doesn't really apply, but anyway.
No, so LICE is just, LICE is mostly something that handles memory bitmaps. So basically it's just shuffling memory around. And then there are some routines that copy that to a format that is suitable to render on the screen. But mostly it's just code that you can compile and hack, but it's not using any GPU or whatever. This is also the reason, I guess, why Reaper is not using the GPU to draw things.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Yeah, are we missing something? Do you think that there's something else we should look at?
Well, this is, I guess, is mostly it.
Right, okay. So, yeah, we have been going on for almost 2.5 hours at this point.
Yeah.
Time flies. So I guess it's time for us to wrap up, but there are a couple things that I want to say. First of all is thank you very much, because it has been very entertaining, and I always enjoy talking to you. People here on the chat seem to agree, because they are participating and everything. So that's nice. And yeah, I'm looking forward to actually using some Clap plugins in the near future. I think that people should go to the link in the description and find out more about your plugins. And any other final messages?
Well, I guess maybe we should also add a link to Keybase on the description, or maybe not now. But I'm with developing Clap. I'm also developing one of our free plugins, Keybase, that now supports Clap both on Windows and Mac OS. But the thing is, it's of course in a very early stage, so maybe it's not a good idea to spread it around too much yet. But
did you notice any difference in terms of performance or anything?
Well, not yet. So Keybase is a simple plugin, so it's not using that much CPU anyway, so it's kind of hard to really measure. But it seems to be pretty much on par with the other stuff. But of course, that's in Reaper, and Reaper tends to be very efficient as well. So
yeah, okay. And all right, so people should check out Keybase as well as all the other plugins you do, because I think you at some point you're going to be adding support for Clap to them as well.
yeah, I think if everything works good, but that could take a while before we know that. But then the idea is to add Clap to all plugins that we make. Yeah, because why not?
All right. Okay. So again, thank you very much to you, Theo, and thank you to people here on the chat: Bo, Rob, Mage, M9, Justin, Martin, Mike from Let's Talk About Reaper, Mr. Jav. Thank you all for joining us here on the chat. Thank you to people who are watching this and are not on the chat. And I guess the schedule moving forward is I am not going to stream tomorrow because today was a long stream, but perhaps I will be streaming with Arya on Friday on his channel, IDGQD Sound. Maybe. We haven't really talked yet, but maybe we'll be streaming together, or I will be here streaming on Friday and continuing my JSFX auto mixer. We'll see. And yeah, thank you very much to you all. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching the stream, you know how great it has been. Or maybe it sucked, and I am glad that you stuck with me. And soon we'll all will be back together for some more coding or talking or chilling. The next time I'll be streaming.